Good morning. Got a lively crowd today. It's a good thing. Everybody's awake. It feels like it's been about 2 weeks, 3 weeks maybe, since we talked about 1 Corinthians. Last week was great. It was terrific to have Chris Emerson speak during this period and enjoyed that very much, and I'm sure you did too. Today we're going to focus our attention once again on 1 Corinthians. We're going to make up a little bit of ground if I can. I don't know if I'm capable of doing that, but we're going to try to do that this morning. We ended in 1 Corinthians chapter 1, verse 17, 2 weeks ago. And I'm just going to do a very, very brief recap of a couple of things from that class as we move from verse 18 forward today. I would like to get through most of chapter 2 today. We'll see if we can. If you'll notice on our outline that I've got up here, where I talk about the problem of division, and I have that going from chapter 1, verse 10 through the end of chapter 4. And that really is true. When you're looking at the first 4 chapters of 1 Corinthians, it's one argument, one discussion by Paul. He's really talking about the same thing throughout those 4 chapters, addressing the same thing. And so when you look at that section of 1 Corinthians, in some ways it's helpful to look at that as a unit, versus this verse and the next verse and the next verse, if you just read it all and think of it in that way. So we're going to kind of cover it a little bit that way, and that'll help us make up a little bit of time, get us back on track. But I think it's also the best way to look at this section. The other thing that I want to say at the outset today is that this section is deeper, I think, sometimes than we give it credit for. It's just not about a simple division where people are aligning themselves with one teacher or another. That is a symptom of a bigger issue that Paul is talking about. And so today I want to try to bring out that bigger issue that Paul is discussing here, rather than getting too focused on the things that we often talk about here. But he does, of course, begin here in chapter 1 with this subject of division. We talked about it last week, and we came to some conclusions from this first section, which ran verse 10 through verse 17. And that is, he's addressing this idea that there are quarrels among them. This is a symptom of a problem that he's describing. There are quarrels, and so there are things that are happening here. They have quarrels, they've divided over leaders, they're attaching themselves to one man over another man, and why is that happening? And Paul says that the answer to this is the cross-centered gospel. He said the answer to all of these problems is that we focus on the cross. And so I suggested a couple of things at the end of class. I don't think I really even talked much about point 3 here. But he says, we must choose to agree to avoid division. We must choose. We must pursue agreement. Choose to agree. Secondly, we must focus on the things that matter most. He points them back to the cross. He says, this is what is important. The cross is important. And then 3, we must discuss things in order to agree. We have to have some consensus in our conversation, in what we talk about, in order that we might agree about things. So we must discuss things. And then I've got 2 other points here. Using the scripture as our guide, and that becomes really apparent, that we must trust in the wisdom of God rather than the wisdom of men. It's going to be a big part that he talks about here. And then secondly, deferring to one another in matters of opinion. And he goes into this much further in chapter 8 and to some extent, you could say in chapter 9 as well. In that case, loving one another becomes our guide. All right? Because we're going to run into things in our family here where the scriptures are not necessarily forthcoming because they're matters of opinion, matters of judgment. So when we run into these, if it's a matter of what God says, we should follow what God says. If it becomes a matter of opinion, then our guide is, how much do you love your brother? And that's the guide there. But then I want to begin now in verse 18, where Paul says, the word of the cross is foolishness to those who are perishing, but to us who are being saved, it is the power of God. There have been many, many sermons, great sermons preached from this verse. The word of the cross is foolishness to those who are perishing, but to us who are being saved, it is the power of God. So there are two points of view of the cross, and he presents them here. For those who are perishing, the cross is foolishness. He's going to elaborate a great deal on this verse in this chapter as we go forward this morning. He's going to elaborate this on a lot. But there are two views of the cross. One is foolishness. And it's foolishness to those who are perishing. But to those who are being saved, we have a second view and a second group of people. It is the power of God. The foolishness of the cross is the power of God to who? To those who are being saved. And so when we think about our world today, and we're going to talk a little bit about their world as Paul is talking, but a lot of this applies so clearly to our world today. If you were to look at the world today, you would see these same two views of the cross and these same two groups of people who hold those views. That the cross of Christ is foolishness to the world, which is being lost, but it is the power of God to those who are being saved. And if we look about us, isn't that exactly what we see? There are those who believe, and there are those who consider it all foolishness. And that those who believe it are foolish and are an object of ridicule. That's the world that we live in, and that's what we see. Then Paul follows that verse by saying, "For it is written, I will destroy the wisdom of the wise, and the cleverness of the clever I will set aside." Now, if you look at across different translations, you see that that's translated in various ways. I think, if I remember, the New International Version says the intelligence of the intelligent, or something like that, versus the cleverness of the clever. But Paul here is quoting from Isaiah chapter 29 and verse 14. "I will destroy the wisdom of the wise, and the cleverness of the clever I will set aside." Something I realized in my Bible studies a long time ago is that when you see a New Testament writer quoting something from the Old Testament, that his point is usually, typically, much larger than the single verse or two verses that are being quoted. That he's usually pointing you to a whole passage of Scripture. Or in some case, the context of a passage. Or even in some cases, to the message of a particular prophet. And that is certainly the case here in 1 Corinthians. In this first 4 chapters here we're talking about, Paul is going to quote from Isaiah 3 times, from 3 different sections of Isaiah. And I think the point is that Paul is bringing our attention to the message of Isaiah as it relates to what he's talking about here. So here he says, "I will destroy the wisdom of the wise, and the cleverness of the clever I will set aside." So I want us to turn over to Isaiah for a few moments. And I'm going to go ahead and look at all of the passages that are quoted here and the context of those things. But he begins here in Isaiah chapter 29. And in Isaiah chapter 29, he is making this broad statement here about the wisdom of men. Isaiah, if you think about, and we studied Isaiah not too long ago, but if we just made a broad general statement, we would say Isaiah is God's, in history, God is addressing all the nations. He's addressing all of the nations, his plans for them, and his plan for the eternal messianic kingdom which is to come. That's the agenda of Isaiah. And there are some specific things, but Isaiah covers a lot of ground. And it is, if you think of it as, God explaining himself and what it is he's doing throughout history and where he's going with all of this. And in many ways, that's the message of Isaiah. And that's the message of Paul here in 1 Corinthians. So he says in Isaiah 29, he says, "Therefore, behold, I will once again deal marvelously with this people, wondrously marvelous, and the wisdom of their wise men will perish, and the discernment of their discerning men will be concealed." Here he has been talking about, in this particular section, he's talking about his own people, the Jewish nation, and how he's going to deal with them. But he's making other points about other nations. For example, if you look back real quickly at 1 Corinthians chapter 1, after he quotes from Isaiah 29 and verse 14, he says, "Where is the wise man? Where is the scribe? Where is the debater of this age? Has not God made foolish the wisdom of the world?" So it's as though as Paul is calling out and challenging those that he's addressing. He says, where's the wise man? And some people look at this verse and they think that Paul makes three statements. One is a general statement, where is the wise man? Secondly, he says, where is the scribe? And many people think that there he is calling out the arrogance of the Jewish people. And then secondly, he says, where's the debater of this age? And it would be very easy to understand that as referring to the Greeks and their philosophers and their desire to debate. In our introduction, I brought your attention to Acts chapter 17, where Paul is in Athens, and he is appearing there before the wise men who wanted nothing more than to sit around every day and hear something new. And that's how they're described. And they refer to Paul as an idle babbler. I don't know if you recall us looking at that. But here Paul calls out that group. He says, where's the wise man? Where's the scribe? And the scribe, we think of the scribes of Israel. And where is the debater of this age? This notion of this age is going to come up again in chapter 2 and verse 6. He's going to refer to the present age again. He says, we do speak wisdom among those who mature in wisdom, however, not of this age or of the rulers of this age who are passing away. And I think that's a very important point for us to make here, is that Paul, when I said this passage is deeper than we sometimes originally think of it when we just read it casually, Paul is drawing the contrast between the age of the wisdom of men, the ages in which men sought their own solutions to things, and now he says, we're now in a new age. And what age is that? It is the age of the cross. The age in which the Son of God has come and brought the final solution for man's sin. So he says, where's the wise man? Where's the scribe? Where is the debater of this age? Has not God made foolish the wisdom of the world? Now, what I want to bring out about that is, look over to, back to our idea of Isaiah here. Look over to Isaiah chapter 15. I'm sorry, Isaiah chapter 19. In Isaiah chapter 19, I'm going to begin in verse 11. Now, in this section of Isaiah, pronouncements are being made about lots of nations. If you just flip a page or two back, he addresses, talks about Assyria. He's going to talk about Babylon. He's going to talk about Moab. And he now comes to, in verse 19, he is talking about Egypt. Now, when you think of Egypt, I follow an account on social media of a guy who's fascinated with ancient Egypt, and he's constantly going around and showing you things in ancient Egypt. He's in videos on YouTube where he talks about the pyramids and all of these things, and it's truly more remarkable when you look. I mean, think about it. Ancient Egypt did things that we still don't understand. No one knows how they made the pyramids, right? When we talked about Apollos a few weeks ago, we talked about where was Apollos from? Alexandria. What's significant about Alexandria? The most famous library in ancient history. The knowledge held by the ancient Egyptians is remarkable. We still recognize that it's remarkable. But here, Paul is, or Isaiah is going to contrast the knowledge and wisdom of the Egyptians with that of God. So he says in verse 11, the princes of Zoan are mere fools. The advice of Pharaoh's wisest advisors has become stupid. How can you men say to Pharaoh, I am a son of the wise and a son of ancient kings? Well then, where are your wise men? Do you think Paul's mind is on the book of Isaiah as he writes these things in 1 Corinthians? He says that he makes the same argument after quoting chapter 19, or chapter, the previous chapter in verse 29 rather. Now he comes to this passage in verse 19. He's not quoting it, but he makes the same argument. Where are your wise men? Please let them tell you and let them understand what the Lord of hosts has purposed for Egypt. The princes of Zoan who have acted foolishly, the princes of Memphis are deluded. Those who are the cornerstone of her tribes have led Egypt astray. The Lord has mixed within her a spirit of distortion. They have led Egypt astray in all that it does, as a drunken man who staggers in his vomit. Pretty graphic picture, isn't it? As he's describing the wisdom of Egypt as compared to what God is planning and what God is going to do with Egypt in judgment, is as these men are believing a distortion and they're leading about Pharaoh like a drunken man stumbling in his own vomit. And so Paul says, where's the wise man? Where's the scribe? Where's the debater of this age? And so he's throwing out the same challenge that God threw out to the wise men of Egypt. You don't know anything. You can't even comprehend what it is God is doing and what is coming about to you. I want us to look over back to 1 Corinthians, and I want to, while we're in Isaiah, I want to look at this couple of other passages. In chapter 1 he says, after he says, where's the wise man, where's the debater of this age? Has God not made foolish the wisdom of the world? You see, the problem is when we look at the Corinthian church and they're aligning themselves with this teacher or that teacher, why are they doing that? Are these teachers teaching something different? No, they're not teaching anything different. They're all teaching the same gospel. Why are they aligning themselves? Because they are looking at things from a worldly standpoint. What becomes really obvious, I think, it's not explicitly stated, there's no division, there's no daylight between Paul and Apollos. They're teaching the same gospel. In chapter 16, Paul is going to say, I'm trying to convince Apollos to come back there. If Paul thought there was a problem with Apollos, he wouldn't want Apollos to go back to Corinth. They're aligned. They're on the same page. But the people are looking at things differently. And how are they looking at things differently? Well, there are clues, as we've alluded to, if we look at the two men. Paul makes a big point. He's going to come back in chapter 2. He says, when I came to you, brethren, I did not come with superiority of speech or wisdom, proclaiming to you the testimony of God, for I determined to know nothing among you except Jesus Christ and him crucified. I was with you in weakness and in fear and in trembling. He says, and my message and my preaching were not in persuasive words of wisdom, but in demonstration of the Spirit and power, so that your faith would not rest on the wisdom of God, or wisdom of men, but on the power of God. Now, in contrast to what Paul just described, what do we know about Apollos from Acts chapter 18? He was a very eloquent, very educated man. And from the background and culture of Corinth, it's a Roman city, but it has a very Greek culture. From their background, boy, wasn't Apollos smooth. Apollos probably illustrated things with all kinds of contemporary language. And so some are discerning things from a worldly standpoint, and they've taken Apollos and they've lifted Apollos up. So you got people that are really saying, hey, I'm with Apollos. And other people say, no, I'm with Paul. Paul's the one that came here first and taught us. And Paul is saying, you're looking at things the wrong way. And we know that that's the problem because everything Paul says now through the end of chapter 4 is addressing that specific issue. The wisdom of men and this idea, and it's hard for us to kind of maybe appreciate when Paul talks about the wisdom of men and when he talks about the words of wisdom, he's talking about that in a very specific cultural context as it relates to Greek philosophy and all of those things. Every now and then, as an aside, every now and then, to illustrate that, every now and then I'll be studying something and I kind of come up with what I think the passage is talking about, and I kind of write it all out and explain it myself. And then I'll read somewhere else and I'm like, they're saying the same thing I am. They're just using bigger words. They're using the words that they learned in their PhD program or whatever, right? Because we know that educated people, and I'm not disparaging educated people, although most educated people find themselves in trouble. It's like wealth. God doesn't say every wealthy man's going to hell. What he says is it's very difficult for a wealthy man to get to heaven. It's not 100%. But we have all seen people who go on to higher education. And not because they're learning things, but because they're learning things from the perspective of the world, and they're persuaded by those things, and because there's certain prestige that comes with all of that, they're very tempted to go in a certain direction. We've all seen the people who go off to college, a strong, faithful Christian, and come out of their PhD program, and their brain has been turned to mush. They're like the Egyptians who wallow around like a drunk man in his own vomit when it comes to perceiving and understanding the things of God. Now, I'm not against education at all, but I am cautioning us with Paul that there is a wisdom of the world which cannot find God, cannot see God. He says, as we go down here, he says, the wisdom of God since in the wisdom of God, the world through its wisdom did not come to know God, God was well pleased through the foolishness of the message preached to save those who believe. What does he say there? He says, the world in all of its wisdom, for all of the ages, the world could not find God, using its own standards, using its own measure. He goes on to say, he says, for indeed the Jews ask for signs and the Greeks search for wisdom. So if we're talking about the message of the cross, if we're trying to understand the message of the cross, he says the message of the cross is a stumbling block to the Jews, verse 23, and for the Greeks, it's foolishness. When you think about it, Christ crucified is a very challenging idea. It's two ideas that seem incompatible. For the Jewish mind, it was inconceivable that the Messiah, who was to come with power and liberation of the people, who will cast off their enemies, is inconceivable that you would say that the Christ is crucified. How can the Messiah, who is going to come with power, end up crucified? And so Paul describes it as a stumbling block. The message of the cross is a stumbling block to the Jews. Why? Because it doesn't fit what they thought was going to happen. It doesn't fit, as we often hear people say, it doesn't fit their narrative. They had it all laid out, what was going to happen. This is what they expected. This is what they wanted to happen, and that's not what happened. And so Paul says it was a stumbling block to them. And if you think back again to our reference to Acts chapter 17, when Paul delivers this magnificent sermon on Mars Hill to all these philosophers in Athens, and he comes down and he gets to the death and resurrection of Christ, what happens? They said, we're done with this. This guy's crazy. And they walk away. Because it was inconceivable in a city which was a Roman colony with a Greek, this culture of wisdom behind it. It's inconceivable that God could have been crucified by Romans. How ridiculous. You're going to tell us that that's your God? Your God that the Roman soldiers just threw on a cross? It's foolishness to them. But why is it foolish? It's foolish because there's a certain way of thinking from the perspective of the world. There are many people who love God as long as they get God on their own terms. As long as they get to define who God is and what God does and why He does it, then I'm okay with that. But as soon as God doesn't fit what I thought God should be or what God should be for me in my life, well, then I'm out. I'm out of that. I don't want any part of that. And we see it all the time. Sometimes it's us. Our faith wavers because we just don't understand what God's doing. It's hard for us to comprehend and appreciate and accept what it is God's doing. So here, he says, we preach Christ crucified, to the Jews a stumbling block, and to the Gentiles foolishness, but to those who are the called, both Jews and Greeks, Christ, the power of God and the wisdom of God. Not the wisdom of man, but the wisdom of God. If you set aside your worldly perspective and surrender to the wisdom of God, everything falls into place. He says, because the foolishness of God is wiser than men, and the weakness of God is stronger than men. So now I want to turn your attention back over to Isaiah. What is happening in Isaiah? The same argument is being made here. As Isaiah is laying out what God is going to do. In Isaiah chapter 40, verse 12, he says, who has measured the waters in the hollow of his hand, and marked off the heavens by the span, and calculated the dust of the earth by the measure, and weighed the mountains in a balance, and the hills in a pair of scales? Who has directed the Spirit of the Lord, or as his counselor has informed him? With whom did he consult, and who gave him understanding? And who taught him in the path of justice, and taught him knowledge, and informed him of the way of understanding? Now, do you recognize those verses? You recognize those verses? We sing those verses in a song here. In a song, Behold Our God. And this is how it goes. Who has beheld the oceans in his hand? Who has numbered every grain of sand? Kings and nations tremble at his voice. All nations rise to rejoice. Behold our God seated on his throne. Come, let us adore him. Behold our King, nothing can compare. Come, let us adore him. Who has given counsel to the Lord? Who can question any of his words? Who can teach the one who knows all things? Who can fathom all his wondrous deeds? Now I want you to listen to this last verse and think about it in the context of Paul. As Paul is pointing to Isaiah 40. He's going to quote Isaiah 40 here in chapter 2. So we know that he has in mind chapter 19 or chapter 29. We know he has in mind chapter 19 because he virtually quotes it. And we know he has in mind chapter 40. In the latter part, before I read the last verse of that song, look in 1 Corinthians chapter 2. In 1 Corinthians chapter 2, he says, yet do we speak wisdom among those who are mature, a wisdom, however, not of this age, nor of the rulers of this age who are passing away, but we speak God's wisdom in a mystery, the hidden wisdom which God predestined before the ages to our glory. So he's talking about the ages that we live in, an age which is going to pass away. because of the coming of the Son of Man. The age of man's wisdom is going to pass away. He says, but before the foundation of the world, he was planning these things in his wisdom. He says, the wisdom which none of the rulers of this age have understood, for if they'd understood it, they would have not have crucified the Lord of glory. But just as it is written, things which eye has not seen, and ear has not seen, which have not entered the heart of man, all that God has prepared for those who love him. So Paul is going from before the foundation of the world through all of the time that we can witness as man. God has been doing something, and what he is doing, and he has been preparing for our salvation. So we go back over here to Isaiah. What does he say? He says the things of the song that we sing, but listen to this last verse. Who has felt the nails upon his hands, bearing all the guilt of sinful man? God eternal, humbled to the grave, Jesus Savior, risen now to reign. The writer of this song got the point. He goes from Isaiah and the power of God as he challenges the wisdom of men and says, I have been doing something marvelous, something that has been hidden throughout time, but now is revealed in a Savior on a cross. And so Paul is telling these Corinthians, if you're making the mistake of the ancient Egyptians, you're foolish. If you think the wisdom of men, the perspective of men is going to get you to Christ, then you're mistaken. You're going to miss everything that God has been doing by relying upon the wisdom of men. Don't do it. Don't look at the wisdom of men for answers to the things that we're talking about. So when we sing that song, for example, we should recognize that song is bigger than we may even realize. When we think about these passages, this argument that Paul is making here in these first 4 chapters, don't look at the wisdom of men. Now, for just a moment, though, I want to step back from this idea of the high and mighty educated, that that's who the wisdom of men is. In another sense, Paul is simply talking about a worldly perspective. That you're letting the world creep in and affect how you see things. Don't let the world influence you. Recognize that it is the simple things that matter. And so he turns, he says, in verse 25, the foolishness of God is wiser than men, and the weakness of God is stronger than men. What is the weakness of God he's referring to? Well, you really have to use a lot of air quotes for Paul when you're reading this. A lot of air quotes. There's a lot of sarcasm and a lot of accommodative language. What is the weakness? Well, God has no weakness, but it is weakness as it is perceived by men. God has done the things which men would assume is weak. Like, for example, he sends his son, and his son is arrested, beaten, and killed. Well, that would be perceived as weakness by men, as defeat. He says, what you perceive as defeat, God has made to be victorious. It is victory. So he then illustrates it, and he says, look at yourselves, brethren. Let's illustrate it this way. Consider your calling, brethren. There were not many wise according to the flesh, not many mighty, not many noble. Look at yourselves. The rulers of Corinth aren't here. The mighty, noble people, they're not here in great numbers. We know that there's indications that there were 2 rulers of the synagogue. We know that there were other wealthy individuals who'd been successful in trade and merchandising in Corinth who were members of the church. Gaius hosted the entire church in his home. Gaius was a wealthy man. So there are no such thing as absolutes. No rich man will go to heaven. That's not what the Bible says. But here he says, look at yourselves. God chose you. Who listened to the gospel when I was in Corinth? You did. How many of you are the wise, mighty, noble people of Corinth? Not many. Look at yourselves. He says, but God has chosen the foolish things of the world to shame the wise, and has chosen the weak things of the world to shame the things that are strong. So we'll summarize a little bit of chapter 1. We'll go through chapter 2 very quickly next week and get deep into chapter 3. So I appreciate your attention. And go back and read through these passages in Isaiah chapter 40 and see the similarity of what Paul's arguing. Thank you.
Son of my soul, thou Savior dear, it is not night if thou be near. O may no earth-born cloud arise to hide thee from thy servant.